My name is Max Gagliardi, and you're listening to the Talk Energy podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app, leave a review, help me out. This episode's guest is Ryan Leachman, the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of J Energy. Ryan was born and raised in the Canadian oil fields and started out his career as a petroleum engineer. After a well that his company drilled didn't have access to a pipeline, Ryan got his first experience with Bitcoin mining, using it as a way to mitigate flared gas in the oil field. After seeing their first Bitcoin mine firsthand, Ryan and his partner Justin decided to start J Energy to pursue Bitcoin full-time. This episode's filled with discussions about what it's like going from an oil and gas background into Bitcoin mining. We talk about the challenges of mining in the oil field and how flared gas may be a great use case for Bitcoin mining, but how it might not be the easiest way to scale a mining venture. And lastly, we talk about what it's like bootstrapping a mining venture from scratch and going full send into the oil field Bitcoin mining world. Hope you enjoy the show. Ryan, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on.
Hey man, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm just got to tell you, we had some technical difficulties earlier. Maybe you already heard me say this, but it seems like you're killing it. You're in Wyoming. I'm following the stuff you've been posting. It looks gorgeous there. You're mining a bunch of Bitcoin. It just seems like you're kind of living the dream, although I can't put myself in your shoes, but from the outside looking in, man, it looks like you're crushing it.
Yeah, life is good. I'm trying to be a big Wyoming advocate and show everybody what everything Wyoming has to offer and the opportunities here. It's a great place to be. Going on my third year here. Just over a year ago, we got our house here. We've got a little chunk of land. We've got a garden we're trying to grow all our vegetables in. We got some chickens running around the property, and we got some bees, so we should be harvesting some honey here in a week or two. So views of the Bighorn Mountains out the window. Can wake up in the morning, have coffee, and look out at the windows. It's a great little spot.
That's awesome. Yeah, it looks cool. I love the gardening stuff. It's like you're doing a lot of things that I feel like if I had the time, maybe you just have to carve the time out. I mean, we grew like some tomatoes this year, and I felt really proud. But to have like the full garden with all the stuff and the bees. My wife's family lives on some land here in Oklahoma and had bees growing up, and it's just cool. Like I just vibe with all that stuff, and I've got 3 little kids, so it's hard to do it all. But I'm envious of that. I think it just looks really fun. And then the other thing is that the Bitcoin mining, and we'll launch into all that, but also envious of that. It looks like you guys are crushing it there. And maybe before we just jump into the Bitcoin, like just your background, and I know you're an oil and gas guy, and I think that's where I'm kind of wanted to have you on the podcast and relate with you from a distance, is because oil and gas guy that's now doing the Bitcoin stuff. And so maybe just walk me through your background before we launch into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Canadian. I was born and raised right on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, just south of a town called Lloydminster. So it's a small oil and gas farming community, about 2,000 people where I grew up. My parents, both sides, mom and dad, they were both farmers growing up. And then my dad, probably about 15 or 16 years old, he quit school 9th or 10th grade and started working on the rigs. And when he turned 18, he had saved up enough money to buy an oil hauling truck, and so he started hauling oil. And then he built up that business and ended up selling his oil hauling business and started pickers and winch trucks. And he had built a big pipe yard, and he was servicing all the drilling rigs in the area with his equipment. And so yeah, I grew up around oil and gas my whole life. I was starting to work in his mechanics bay on all of his big trucks when I was pretty little. Once I turned 14, I was able to drive a scooter from our farm out to where his shop was. You just have a learner's permit or whatever, and so I was ripping out there and helping the mechanic. And then started working after, during the summers and stuff during high school, doing some pipeline insulation work around the town that I grew up in. So really, oil and gas is all I've ever known. My dad basically told me, he's like, you better go to school. I just kind of wanted to go to work right out of high school. I didn't really want to go to college, to be honest. My parents definitely, twisted my arm, made sure. So I actually just went and did a 2-year petroleum engineering diploma in Edmonton, in Alberta, at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. And my thoughts was, all right, this is the quickest thing I can do. It keeps me in the oil and gas industry, and then I'll just go straight to work. So I did the 2-year diploma, and then once I was actually in school, I was like, I'm pretty good at this. I'm learning a lot of stuff, and I think I started realizing that there's a chance that I'm going to be reporting to some engineer for the rest of my life if I kind of stay on this track, and that's not really what I wanted to do. So I transferred down to Montana Tech and finished my degree there. I was there for 2 years, and it was when I was at Montana Tech that Anadarko Petroleum recruited me, and so I started interning with them. My first summer with them, I was out in Ozona, Texas, split my time between Ozona and the Woodlands. And then the next summer, I was up out of their Denver office, and I worked the Salt Creek field as well. So I was going up into Wyoming. That was my first real experience getting any time in Wyoming. Got to work one of the the most historic plays pretty much across the United States, the Salt Creek field there. So that was pretty cool. And then hired on full time with Anadarko, and I got to Houston. And my manager at the time when I'd got there was like, "You haven't got an apartment, have you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I got one. Obviously, I'm, showed up today." And he's like, "Well, I kind of forgot to tell you." He's like, "We actually want you down in South Texas." So I moved down to Uvalde, and I was traveling back on a lot of the weekends back to Houston. But I was actually one of the first production engineers.
Sorry,
that was
I think there's a delay.
I
laughed. Can you hear me still?
At the time, it was still kind of in an exploration play. So it was a lot of fun. Got to see a lot of stuff. That was really my introduction to Texas, and spent a lot of time was literally right on the Mexican border. Being a Canadian with having to carry my passport around with me and not an American citizen, going through border checkpoints and things like that was a little interesting. After that, I moved, started working West Texas for Anadarko. We were doing a lot of the Delaware Basin, Bone Springs, Avalon Shale. And then I was on some of the very first Wolfcamp wells that Anadarko had drilled and completed. So it was a lot of fun working that asset, working the Delaware from the very first initial wells, being on their exploration team. After that, from Anadarko, I went over to Parsley Energy, moved to Austin. It was a lot of fun. I was in Austin for a couple of years working for Parsley, and obviously they were a pure Permian player at the time. Obviously they've been picked up by Pioneer now, but they were obviously in a lot more development mode, so it was, taking a lot of things that we had learned from Anadarko and taking it over to Parsley and helping them out. And I was working both Delaware and Midland Basin at the time. And then, there's some people that I'd worked with at Anadarko in the past, some good friends of mine that had started a company, a private equity-backed oil company. They got a position in Wyoming, and they had called me and said, "Hey, we need an operations guy, and we need somebody that's actually, up there and can get their hands on everything. Would you be interested in coming on board?" And so I moved over to Century Oil and Gas, like I said, as a private equity-backed team, and came on as a partner in the company, and I was handling all the day-to-day operations up here. And so we had a couple different positions. We had drilled a new exploration well in the Powder River Basin here. And then we also ended up taking over management of another company out of Gillette, too, that we were handling a Minnelusa water flood where we had a few hundred wells that we were handling the day-to-day operations of, too. So it was a lot of fun, but now I'm Bitcoin mining.
You told me your background, and that was good, and I loved hearing that. One similar thing that when you told me about your dad's background, I don't know if you know Harold Hamm's story, but I guess he kind of didn't go the conventional school route and started his own oil hauling business. I don't know, have you heard about his story at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It kind of reminded me of what you're saying with your dad, just started out scrappy with a truck and hauling oil, and then made a service business around it, which is really cool. I mean, it's just how do you get out there, create value, make something happen? And I love stories like that.
Yeah, he's definitely a respectable guy. It's one that, complaining about a hard work day or something like that, but you compare, upbringing or potential that he's allowed me to have versus what he had. It's you don't have a leg to stand on to complain. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So you're at the private equity company, and I'm familiar with private equity stuff. A lot of our clients at Ancova are private equity backed companies. We've actually raised private equity for a midstream venture. So I've kind of been on both sides of it. We worked for a lot of guys that are in private equity. We've raised private equity. It's just a challenging time, over the last couple of years to be in that space. And so from there to Bitcoin, talk to me about that, journey and that step.
Yeah. So the way that it worked was that we had drilled an exploration well at the end of 2018 and brought it on in 2019. And when I'm talking exploration well, this is true exploration play. It's on the eastern flanks of the Powder River Basin, very remote areas. you're talking hour plus drives without seeing another car before you get to this well, and we were what our possibilities were for getting this well to market. One, it's an exploration well. You need to keep it online. You want to get the data. You want to try to get some return on your investment. But then also you come up against a flaring limitation or whatever the regulation is at the time. And so we knew we had we hadn't a flare extension on this well. We had so many days that we could flare it for, but obviously we needed to have a plan in place, and it was either lay a pipeline or we were looking at all possible options at that time, but laying a line would have just completely killed the economics of the well. And so, this was in essence, like a true stranded well opportunity, right? Like prime for Bitcoin mining. And so that's what we ended up doing. So in 2019, we put our first Bitcoin mine on this well, and it was great. I mean, to be honest, at the time, we weren't really concerned about the Bitcoin side of it. It was 100% the ability to keep oil flowing and our well online. And that was really the entrance for it. And it wasn't until we got it on, and, personally for me, it was digging into like, what exactly are we doing here? I was completely green, didn't understand it at all. I just, my oil production was flowing. That's really all I cared about. But started digging into it more, learning it more. And that's where I was just like, hey, this is, there's definite potential here. We need to look into, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and how we might be able to do something ourselves on a more grand scale, really.
Absolutely. You and I have talked just briefly in the past. We connected a few months ago, and one of the things we discussed, I think we talked about this, was just like the Bitcoin mining space in general seems like it's just such a good fit for guys with oil and gas backgrounds. I mean, if you think about like the problems that we have to face in the oil industry, like these complex problems, like large scale logistics, risk taking, how to understand complex economics, dealing with like volatile commodities that change in price that you have very little control over, difficulty changing from location or from well to well, having to manage how that difficulty changes, similar to like the difficulty adjustments in the Bitcoin network. I mean, there's just so many parallels, even with the way that difficulty gets harder and over time you get less Bitcoin, wells decline over time. It's like a tight curve. And maybe that's just my bias, but I just keep drawing all these parallels. And so there was something early on when I started learning about Bitcoin mining that just felt gravitated towards it, because it just felt very much like something that oil and gas people could be very good at doing. And that in my prediction is that they will be a lot of the people underpinning this network in some future world.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. I mean, my whole career has been built on risk mitigation, and, I've always been in operations my whole career. And so whether it's on the, water acquisition side, whether it's on drilling, completions, production, bringing the well online, keeping it online, the facility side of things, like there's so much that can go wrong that you need to mitigate all of those risks and try to engineer them out. And, at the end of the day, the best operators in oil and gas are the ones with the lowest costs, right? Being in the best field with the best rock definitely helps. But, the guys that are the most efficient operators are going to be the ones that survive. And really, it's 100% the exact same with Bitcoin mining. And, you mentioned decline curves versus difficulty adjustments and things like that. Like you're spot on it. Like there's so many parallels for sure. And that's really what spurred us to start J Energy was that, so my partner, Justin Ballard, and I, we were at Century, and we had this mine out there, and we started talking. And really what spurred it was that, oil prices were low in 2020, and we got a hole in the tubing on our well. And I'm looking after the day-to-day operations, and I'm out on a location now where I've got, a $45,000 workover to fix this well. Oil prices are sub $30 at the time, and I'm trying to find out, when will this pay? But at the same time, I look across on the other side of my location, and I've got a Bitcoin mine that's down. And so I've got two pieces of stranded capital on my location and trying to figure out what the best route going forward is. So that, eventually we get the well online, we get the mine back online, and, there's later on down the road, we ran into a few more issues where, obviously newly drilled wells, they are on a high decline. The typical well that's drilled in our industry right now is mostly in a shale play or some type of tight oil formation. Within the first year, you're seeing declines, averaging up to 50%, second year, close to 30%. And so, we experienced issues with that as well, where we've got a generator of a certain size, with the ability to output so many kilowatts that requires a certain gas volume. And just over the time we had, where our well declined enough that we couldn't keep that generator loaded anymore. And now we're looking at, a generator that's not able to be fully loaded, which means we've got ASIC miners inside our container that aren't running, which again leads you to stranded capital. And that's kind of how, Justin and I approached this, is we were just like, look, flare gas Bitcoin mining absolutely has a place. We obviously proved it. It gave us the ability to keep our well online, but our thoughts with Jay was kind of go a different route, and we saw that there's a huge market of being able to secure processed gas or clean gas that you've got an abundant supply of, whether it's on midstream lines or gas plants or full field gathering systems. There's so many opportunities, and you can kind of look at it as, if you can dedicate some portion of your gas stream to Bitcoin mining, that that no matter if you have, certain upsets in your facilities or wells go down, things like that it's not going to shut your entire Bitcoin mining operation down too. But it gives you the ability now that you can still sell gas down the sales line and realize, obviously today you're getting $5, which is wild to think that we're in that kind of a situation. But, if you can dedicate 3, 5, 10, 15, 20% of your gas to a Bitcoin mining operation as well, it just gives you that much more ability to play the market, try to get that arbitrage value difference versus the market. And so that's kind of how we looked at it. And, obviously being oil and gas guys, we were able to go and secure our own sites and things like that and make sure that we have gas. And that was kind of the thesis behind starting Jay. And we built our site up pretty quick. April 1st was our, first official day. And, we're looking here September, where we're online for about a month now. And we've got a pretty big operation going, and we're looking at expanding into a few different areas and helping some producers out doing the same thing that we're doing.
Yeah, you guys just went full send. I love it. It's awesome. Just the amount you guys just got them out there. Want to get into some of the details around that, and feel free, if I ask you anything that you can't share, it's confidential, just tell me. We don't want to share that, because I would love to pick your brain on a bunch of things. But one thing, going back to your point around the different applications, I think that I've tried to extrapolate this to a bunch of different stuff in the oil field, and there's some really interesting applications. I kind of have more of a midstream background, although I say that I've worked for producers my whole career. So I've really worked on the upstream side, but it's always been at that intersection between infrastructure and, selling the product. So basically energy and money, kind of where they intersect. And so, and think about it from the midstream angle, if you were a midstream XYZ midstream company and you had a processing plant and you're in competitive processes to go connect wells, and you're out there and you're saying, hey, I got to connect, I'm trying to compete with 4 other midstream companies, and you're able to then take, call it 10% of the gas stream and put it into a Bitcoin miner, a POP, or percentage of proceeds, for a 10% of the gas for, $4 gas, that's 40 cents. Converting that into Bitcoin with, S19s, I did this math a while ago, but it was like $2.80 or $3 or something. I can't remember what it was for that same portion, which is a lot of times like 2 or 3x what the entire midstream fees are, right? Some guys may charge like $1 for gathering, process, compression. So if you can make $2.80 or $3 just for a 10% POP, you would never lose an RFP again unless you were competing against somebody else mining Bitcoin. I say these things to midstream guys, and you can just see the wheels turning in their head. They're like, this is incredible. And so that's just one application. If you think about it from midstream, there's obviously stranded gas, which is the easy one people talk about. I think the flared model is going to be a difficult model to scale a business doing, for the reason you mentioned earlier, wells decline. The other thing I think is difficult is that if you're in like the Bakken or one of these really rich gas plays, and you've got, $4 or $5 gas, and you've got really expensive NGLs, to your point around getting clean gas or getting processed gas, it's like the NGL, some of those gas streams may be $7, $8 right now. I don't know. Maybe they're not getting that back because of fees, but it's just, what you're going to encourage is that you can build a lot of pipe for $7.
No, I completely agree.
Go ahead.
That was the basis behind starting Jay with that kind of mindset, was that, there really wasn't anybody at the time, most people were focused on flare gas, and, we were kind of saying, hey, we see an opportunity elsewhere. And like I said, it's not that I don't think that it can work. It absolutely has its advantages. I mean, case in point, we had it on our well, and then one of the other partners here at Jay, Adam Sarvey is his name. He came from a company that had the very first Bitcoin mine on a well in Wyoming. So the three partners that we have over here, we've all had experience in it here in Wyoming, but it's tough. I mean, there's definitely a market for it, but I just look at it as, you think if you look at the amount of gas that's being flared, and then you convert it into the amount of power that you could have generated. In the United States last year, the amount of gas that was being flared, I think you could have powered almost 50% of the network. Like I think it worked it up to be about almost, 5,000 megawatts worth of power being flared. Like it's an astonishing amount of gas that's being flared. But then what people need to keep in mind is that most gas that is being flared for, 14 days, 45 days, 180 days kind of max. And then that well is being put to sales. And then, the next flare that takes over is the next well that rig had moved on in its drilling schedule. And so it's kind of what you mentioned. If you are to really scale up with flare gas Bitcoin mining, it's going to be somewhat tough, is that you're trying to secure a long-term site that you can stay on, or make sure that you have another well to go to in the future if you're chasing newly drilled wells, which are the majority of wells that are being flared. And when I say majority of wells that are being flared, I'm talking in terms of total volume of gas being flared. Like, for example, we dug into this in Wyoming when we were trying to, create a business model for Jay. And it's like, I was trying to make some notes or dig up my old notes. But, in 2019 and 2020, there's averaged about 40,000 wells in Wyoming. If you take those 40,000 wells, Wyoming peaked at about 30 million cubic feet a day in 2019 of flare gas, which is, it's a substantial amount of gas. It's a really big Haynesville well, a really big Marcellus well. But I mean, in terms of like a full field, it's a good amount of gas. Into 2020, flare gas by the end of 2020 was down to about 7 million cubic feet a day in the whole state. When you break that down a little bit further, that's about 0.25% of Wyoming's gas that's being produced is flared. Right. When you think of it in terms of that, like 30 million cubic feet a day, that'll power 120 plus megawatts. Like, I mean, it's a massive amount of gas, but it's trying to get access to it. And so when you think of it that way, in 2019 and 2020, I looked at it, there was 2,200 wells in average both years that had some amount of gas that was being flared. So like a minimum of 1 MCF. So you think, okay, I've got 2,200 wells as my starting basis point as to, that I want to try to build a Bitcoin mine around. Well, then you break it down and like, well, how much gas on average is each one of those wells flaring? Well, on flared days, those wells were averaging in 2019. Let me see, I had some notes. It was, 36 MCF a day. And so you look at that and you're like, well, 36 MCF a day, what am I around? Maybe 200 kilowatts, 180 kilowatts, something like that. So it's a little bit, but then you look in, well, how many days did those wells flare? And it's significantly less. And so then let's put a filter on it and say, I want to build a 350 kilowatt Bitcoin mine off of flare gas, but I need 90% runtime. And so then you filter how many wells flared for over 300 days. So 90%, let's say 328 or 330 days. When you look at it and filter it like that, I was taking some notes on it, but it was about 0 wells in Wyoming out of the 40,000 flared more than 60 MCF a day for 365 days. And then when you look at 90% uptime in 2019, there was 2 wells that flared more than 60 MCF a day for 330 days. And then you look at 2020, there was 3 wells. And so it just, if you want to have a long-term spot to park your Bitcoin mine on, flare gas is definitely a lot more challenging, unless you go significantly smaller and then you can hope to keep it there. But it starts getting to a point too, are those wells truly flaring because they need to flare? Because almost every single well in the state's has the ability to go to sales. And so, you're just kind of looking at it in a couple of different ways. So, we just looked at it as we want to find a long-term spot that we can put our Bitcoin mine on. We absolutely recognize that flare gas Bitcoin mining has potential and it has its place, but it was just kind of a spot that, will help people out and we can help them build equipment and set it out on their locations. But for us personally on our mining operation, that was just not the route that we ended up taking. And, it was just specifically kind of looking at the stats like that as to, how can I build to scale the mining operation that we want, knowing that we don't want to move it every 180 days or less.
Right. It's tough. I mean, everything you just mentioned is, I didn't have the numbers, I hadn't looked into the details, but I just knew intuitively, right? I mean, like I kind of just felt like I know the midstream business. I know the upstream, I know the production side of the upstream business really well. And I just thought like, this is very hard. It's like I wouldn't say it's a needle in a haystack. It's easier than that, but it's like definitely like weeding through a lot and trying to find these opportunities. Are they long-term? Are they short-term? Is a pipeline eventually going to get there? I mean, at a minimum, it's a treadmill, and the scalability is doable. It's just a logistical. I mean, the amount of logistics involved. And there's also like philosophical things around Bitcoin mining and what the goals are. And so I've studied like short-term, medium-term, long-term Bitcoin mining economics. I know like the modern era really hasn't been that long. And let's call it from 16 till now, kind of since the S9s came out. Until today. And it's like, you can look at that and everybody's focused on OPEX, and it's obviously important. I think I put a tweet out this the other day, and maybe when you and I last talked, we talked about this, and it was like, is it really an OPEX game? I mean, a lot of people will tell you absolutely it is. And that makes sense, because when you zoom in, OPEX is material, right? Like when the difficulty goes up, the price crashes, and OPEX, you could be upside down. You don't want to, then you can't sell your miners because it's not very profitable to mine. So the value of your equipment falls. But when you zoom out even just a little bit, and then especially if you zoom out a lot to a multi-year look, OPEX is just like white noise, because Bitcoin, the price, how much it's gone up. Now, I don't know that you can bet on that when planning an operation, but I think a lot of these public guys are. I mean, to them, it's, yes, they want cheap power, but it's how much Bitcoin can I accumulate, how quickly, because if Bitcoin's really going to this larger price environment, 100,000, 200,000, $1 million a coin in some future world, then whether you paid, 3 cents a kilowatt hour or 8 cents a kilowatt hour, as long as you weren't in the red, then if you had a bigger scale, you win, right? Smaller scale, you lose, bigger scale, you win over time. Am I thinking about that right? Or is it just, I mean, again, like I'm not trying to be important. Let me switch back on. Sorry, my phone rang. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah, I can hear you. No, I think that we probably
think
it fairly similar. It's I agree that there's definitely, you've got a halving event coming up in 3 years that, if you can accumulate potentially more Bitcoin before that, I think that you're definitely setting yourself up and to be in a good position. I think obviously at the end of the day, you need to make sure that your economics work and that you can pay off your investments and you've got a rate of return and everything. But because at the end of the day, in order to hold Bitcoin, if you're not selling your Bitcoin, you need to have cash somewhere else that you're paying your operating expenses for. So you still obviously need to be in the green, but yeah, I think that there's definitely something to be said for scalability right now and being able to produce, basically make as many Bitcoin as you can prior, before getting to a halving event. And then, just talking about, flare gas in general too, some of the things like you're mentioning, it's pretty intuitive. It's what's the hardest thing to comprehend on it is that you look at the total amount of flared gas that's, in volume as to what's being flared. And it's so substantial that, like, obviously there's a lot of opportunity out there. It's just trying to dig down into it and see which ones will make the most sense for you. And then which operators can you actually put this onto their locations that they don't have plans to send it to sales. Because, basically every well, other than some exploration wells and then say some vintage wells that they have downstream line issues that it costs too much to fix their sales lines and things like that, pretty much every well that's online now has the ability to go to sales. And so you're just trying to find out which ones, make the most sense and can you stay on long term, and then have a plan to, where can you go next after this one is either put to sales or is declined enough that you can no longer run your Bitcoin mine on it. And I think that in today's, environment, like especially in oil and gas right now, like there's not a lot of investment coming into the space compared to previous years. Pretty much every operator has recognized that they need to live within their cash flows, and that any money that they spend absolutely needs to be adding value right away. Whereas in the past, it was kind of a race to see who could get the most oil production online, and you could take advantage of, lax flaring limitations in some of these states. And so operators would drill a bunch of wells, get oil production on right away. You get a return on your investment, but you can just kind of kick the can on having your infrastructure in place. Whereas I think that, between today's ESG environment, I think you're going to see more strict regulations on flaring. Almost every state is talking about it, that they want to have zero routine flaring by a certain year. I wouldn't be surprised if they go as far as saying that, we won't approve drilling permits until you 100% have the ability to put your gas to sales to prevent flaring. So I could definitely see, something like that. That's a risk. And, obviously the ESG environment and, outside pressure against flaring, I think you'll definitely see. But then you take the operators, lack of investment coming into the industry right now too. And it just makes sense for companies right now to be drilling wells that they can 100% put to sales. And then you add the fact that we're at $5 gas today too, that, that changes the picture a little bit too. And again, I want to make sure that I reiterate that in no way am I saying that Bitcoin mining off flare gas doesn't work. I mean, I've proven that it does too. I've also just recognized some of the challenges that we have that we necessarily don't want to take up ourselves. But other people have had great success with it, and they'll continue to have success with it. There's definitely a market for it.
For sure. I mean, yeah, the ESG angle for it is good. I mean, obviously you can reduce, methane flares aren't as efficient as combusting it in these generators. And there's a lot there. I've even didn't get on this topic, but we've looked at even on-grid stuff. So we've had to do some soul searching because we were looking at different mining opportunities. We've kind of been broker on the energy side for some groups and worked kind of in the middleman aspect of it. We're like really wanting to get to where we have like our own mining going, and we're been pretty vocal about that. Like I've just been right there, like been on site for deployments, like I've seen it, like I've been a part of the deal kind of on the outside looking in, and it's like we're looking at what are the different strategies. We have clients and operators that have gas that's distressed. It's not stranded, but it's maybe not the best economic situation. We have the ability to buy. There's a lot of wells in Oklahoma that are old wells, and you can buy them, and there's challenges with that, right? You have to operate them, and there's plugging liabilities and other things. And so I've just tried to check myself around biases, and I've been like, okay, well, you've been super hyper focused on natural gas because that's what that's what your experience is. But even just through some like cursory checking in on some grid stuff, and I'm kind of like questioning some of it too, because like I've even like just through like very little research have come across over 100 megawatts in the last weeks of like
no worries.
The problem with doing it on my phone. But I guess what I was saying is that we've actually tried to look on grid for some things just to gut check ourselves. And through just like some not very many phone calls to some co-ops and some things, like we've come across like 100 megawatts of just like 3 to 4.5 cent type, the 3 cents is kind of fake. I think some of these really low cents per kilowatt things you hear on the grid I think they're kind of fake. There's like hidden demand charges and other things baked in there, or like it's kind of like it's like a gas contract. You think, oh, this is a great deal. And then you dig in and you're like, wait, they're keeping my NGLs, they're keeping my drip or whatever. So, but on grid, I think realistically 4 to 5 cents is like achievable, especially in some rural areas. And, and then if you look at like, you're not trying to deploy like 100 megs, like you just want to do like a 1 megawatt deployment. Like we're even questioning, like, do you have a mix? Do you have some stuff that you put on the grid? If you can find an opportunistic, an underutilized substation, right? Like some of these, for example, take some of these oil fields that got built out for ESPs, and now as everybody switched to gas lift. It's like you got all this excess capacity out there, and why not stick a couple mines on? So we're just trying to learn as much as we can and evolve, because like I hate to just get sucked into my biases. But did you guys look on grid at all, or have you been only focused on nat gas? Have you thought about that, or any thoughts there?
Yeah. Obviously started with natural gas. We've got some opportunities coming up that we're hoping to be able to announce here in the next few weeks. But some opportunities that we do have also on grid, but I just can't really speak to them too much.
Sure.
And to be honest, it's Justin would be a lot better one to get on here to talk about some of the on grid, contracting and that kind of stuff. He's been a lot more involved in that, whereas I've been trying to stay up here and focusing more on our operations here. But yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point too. You talk about stranded assets, and the word stranded, I think, gets thrown out a lot, and that there's just a lot of people talking about there's so much stranded assets, you can just go get a Bitcoin mine anywhere. And you made a really good point, especially with plugging liability. I think that that's definitely something that people need to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, we've talked about needing to be cost competitive at some point in time in the future. Absolutely. I think that should be everybody's goal right from the start. But like you said, scalability definitely can add to your economics to the start. But, when you start looking at an MCF, like a unit volume of gas, and you try to convert, what its energy potential is, depending on what type of generator you have, you can make a kilowatt, 3.3 to about 4.2 kilowatts per MCF, depending kind of on the recip gen that you might be using. And let's just say it's 4.2, which is, some of the larger recip gens. So 4.2 kilowatts for every MCF that you burn through it. When you break that down then into $1 per MCF and then go to $1 per kilowatt hour, it's almost for every $1 per MCF, you're looking at 1 cent a kilowatt hour. So let's say, your lifting costs. And when I say lifting costs, like let's say you took over some assets and you were actually operating them yourselves. It's not free to run a field. Like you've got that's the reason a lot of these fields are shut in, is because they do have access to sales, but today's natural gas price environment doesn't allow it. And so that's where you say, okay, well, let's Bitcoin mine on them. And there's definitely some fields out there that are shut in that absolutely would work for Bitcoin mine. But at the same time, at some point in time, you also need to be cost competitive with other people as well, because when the difficulty gets too high, as the hash rate of the network comes up, you need to be economic. And, if you look at what the profitability of ASICs were, a year ago today, an S9 was making less than $1 a day. And so when you think about it like that, $1 per MCF is roughly a cent a kilowatt hour. So if your lifting costs are, say, $2.50 or $3 an MCF to run your field, and that's taking all the expenses in that it just takes to run your field, you're looking at 2.5 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour right there off the top. And that doesn't take into account, your Bitcoin mine and what the investment was, and then also running the Bitcoin mine as well. So, and then the last point that you make is the plugging liability. What a lot of people don't understand is that if you take over wells, you're responsible for the reclamation of those wells as well. And so often that involves putting a bond up front, which is a certain investment or a certain amount of money up front to say, if you walked away from these wells, the state would have the ability to take that money and go plug the well. But depending on the depth of some of these wells, it can get very expensive to plug a well. Right. And I've plugged a lot of wells in my life, and it's very hard to come under budget plugging a well because they're older. You run into casing issues, you run into fishing issues. You always have a best plan in mind, but very rarely does it hit that exact plan. And the older the well gets, the higher the risk is too. So that's just something that people need to keep in consideration if you're trying to take stuff over, is that, what does it cost to plug a well there on average? And you need to bake that into your economics as well.
Yeah, it's going to add to that. No, you're exactly right. Like throwing out that like $250 number for the lifting costs. And then you got to think about, it's not just your OPEX, right? You got to pay royalty owners. You got to pay your partners. So even if you owned your own, let's say you owned 80% of the working interest, and this is just stuff people don't think about this, but right. But you own 80% of the working interest, you got 20% you got to pay to your partners. Maybe you got another 18 or 20% royalties. So now let's call that 40%, 20% to your partners, 20% royalty. So that's 40% times market price. Market price is $5. Now you're basically at, what is that? So you got 20, so you'd be at like a $2. Is that an extra $2? Is that right? Because $1 would be 20%. So 40% would be an extra $2 that you got to pay to your partners. If you're paying your partners at market price and you're paying your royalty owners at market price, if you're not selling some of the gas to the market. So you add those costs in, and you add the plugging cost liabilities in. You add SG&A. You got to have, people to run this thing. And it's not as straightforward as it seems. I think that where it gets difficult is to make the investment underpinned by this. I think it's different when you have go forward economics, like you already have an asset that sucks maybe, or that has problems. I guess maybe sucks is not the right word, but it's having issues in terms of profitability, and you have to figure out a way to maximize that. And to your point, is it like a percentage of your gas? Do you do some amount to kind of help lift the profitability? But when you look into going into an old field and you start to factor in all these things and the execution risk, and then the boat anchor afterwards, right? Like maybe you mine for 5 years and it's great. And then you now still have this $10 million plugging liability that's kind of looming out in front of you at some future date. And so And plus, there's another thing too. It's like aggregation. Is it just a bunch of old wells on a pump jack that flow intermittently? Like, how do you mine with that? Right? Is it aggregated through a midstream company? Is that dedicated? I mean, shoot, 90-something% of wells are dedicated to a midstream provider. So just to think you're going to buy a gas asset and go and mine with it, I mean, there's just so much to think through. I think there's a lot of guys in oil and gas right now that are just glossing over pretty much all of that and just being like, yeah, we're going to get really rich mining Bitcoin. But I think you know as well as I do that there's a lot there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the reason that oil and gas people can be hesitant to get into Bitcoin mining is because they recognize the execution risk and that they recognize that it needs to be a specific asset that you're going to make work. But then I think from the 30,000 foot view, it's kind of the same, what we had just talked about with flare gas mining is that from the 30,000 foot view, there's almost an unlimited potential of flare gas. But when you filter it down to the
Right.
ones that you can actually execute on, it gets significantly smaller. And, the stranded plays are the same thing is that from a 30,000 foot view, there might be, say, in Wyoming, there's 13,000 idled wells right now in Wyoming. If you wanted to go after a full field gathering system or a group of wells, of those idled wells, you're getting into probably a significantly smaller amount that you can actually economically make work. And so it's something that people need to keep in mind. But I mean, it's not to say that the opportunities aren't there. They absolutely are. And, we look into them every day as well, too. So, we've got our finger on it and our pulse on it, and we're trying to see what opportunities do exist. It's just when you take a step back and really dig into it, it's that number becomes a lot smaller for sure.
Right. So pivoting to let's talk a little bit about just the type of containers that you've probably had to look through some different ideas around what to do there. We've done the same. Like, do you build them? Do you buy them? Which ones do you use? What's the right sizing? And then also kind of around, I think you've mentioned S19s and tweets and stuff like that too, but do you do S19s, S9s? I've heard people have very strong opinions on this, in terms of the containers that you use and on the types of ASIC. And so some people just say, for example, S19s don't work great in the oil field. Other people say that that's the way you want to go because why would you not maximize the Bitcoin? I mean, just logistically through the planning of the actual mine itself, just walk me through some of your guys' thoughts and to the extent that you can share where you guys have landed on that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, off the start, that was really a lot of the questions that were asked as we were starting the company is, do we buy third-party containers and 100% source everything, through them and bring them out to our site? What is it that we really want to do? And, at the end of the day, we felt that the more that we creative control and the more control in-house to cut costs and to reduce our operating expenses was really going to be what would give us the most longevity and staying power. And so, through our partners at our company, we've got some fair amount of significantly large fabrication and distribution experience out of Casper, Wyoming. And so, we decided to take 100% of everything that we can in-house. And so, we're fabricating all of our own containers. It's 100% our own design and ideas that we've come up with. We're working with some really great companies in Casper that are helping us out to make sure that we're not missing anything and that they're, using their products and their expertise to really help us out. So it's, there's third-party groups that we use, depending on what it is, whether it's certain automation or electrical or, things like that. But everything that we do is out of Casper. So it's great. It's close to my house. I can get down there and see all of our containers that are currently being built. And the design side, I mean, I think we're foolish to say that you're just going to get something right out of the gate and not going to miss anything and not have any learning curves. I think, you have to fully expect that you're going to improve as you go. And we have made a change probably to every single container that we've built, whether it's just slight tweaks, but I mean, we're always trying to improve on it. But yeah, so everything that we build, it's all 100% through Jay here in Casper. And, we've got 4 containers that are finalizing right now that we're getting ready to ship out to the site here between the 20th and the end of the month. So we've got, we'll be going from right now, we're about 60 petahash, just under 60 petahash at our site, and we'll be up to about 145 petahash here by the end of the month. So we're growing pretty substantially. But yeah, so we started off the first miners that we bought some Avalon 1246s. And those are the ones that we have online right now. They're performing great. We haven't had any issues with them. It's early, but hopefully everything stays the way that it is. And then the next trial ones that we've got coming online, like you mentioned, are S19s. So they're between 95 and 100 terahash that we are bringing on. And so we don't have any of those on in our containers yet. It'll be here coming up. But yeah, I mean, I think you can dig into each miner and hear a positive that people can talk about. You can dig into each one and hear a negative. It's kind of similar to driving a Ford versus Chevy. You know, you can find somebody that can say a positive or negative. But yeah, we'll be putting them to the test. So we're looking forward to it for sure.
That's a good analogy. I like the Ford versus Chevy. Yeah, it's a lot to consider, especially it's like you're making a big capital investment. A couple other things, and I don't know if you can again share on this, but like, for example, like risk mitigation for like insurance. Have you guys been able to solve for that, or is it like, or can you share? If you can't share, that's fine. It's just, those are like some of the questions we have. It's like, especially if you're really remote, it seems like you guys have a fairly aggregated site. So for example, you can have probably better security, better, just line of sight on, you know, whether that be weather events, right? Like if you're on some random lease, like does it flood? Like, I don't know, could it flood in 100-year flood? Like, right? But if you're in like a centralized location, maybe you have a little bit more control over risk of loss, theft, et cetera. I mean, how do you guys think about risk management for your physical assets?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can go into it, just like building, you know, any oil and gas facility or any facility for that matter. But yeah, I mean, insurance is definitely like one of the first things we looked into, and you know, we had different companies looking into, you know, how can you insure these? What are companies that have had, you know, experience in the Bitcoin mining space, insuring Bitcoin mining assets and things like that. So, you know, we dug into that pretty hard and made sure to align ourselves with companies that that have already had some experience in it to make sure that you know, we're protecting ourselves. But yeah, I think you know, that just kind of goes to the other point of, you know, one centralized facility versus a bunch of one scattered out everywhere. And you know, really for us, it came back down to the, you know, when we're sending manpower out to the site, you know, we've got operating expenses that we're incurring every single day, every time you send somebody to location. And so if we can send them to one location versus, you know, 5, 10, 15, you know, there's definitely a significant savings that we can have and optimizations within our company. So that's really another one of the routes that we took, is to, you know, trying to build out one big site here that we've got.
Yeah, for sure.
And then as far as like, you know, remote capabilities or security, you know, we've worked Wyoming for quite a few years on the oil and gas side. And then, like I said, I've worked South Texas, where everything was very remote when we first get into the Eagle Ford. It wasn't when the Eagle Ford had just kind of really blown up and there was rigs everywhere when I started. And then same with the Delaware Basin. It was the same thing when we were out there building facilities and, you know, drilling wells out there. It was, you know, we were drilling the very first Wolfcamp wells that we had. And so, you know, you get to learn, you know, what works, what kind of things do you need on the remote access side, or the ability to monitor, you know, what things could you try to learn to do from your house as opposed to trying to send people out? Because the other thing you got to keep in mind too is that at the end of the day, you want to make sure everybody ends up home and, you know, safe and with their family. And the more time spent on the road, the higher the chances are that something goes south. So, you know, we're trying to limit the amount of times that we actually need to send people to our site as well.
Right. That's smart. And people, you know, talk about safety in the oil field. What are like road incidents? Like what percentage is that? It's high.
Yeah.
A guy come on to talk about it, and it's, I can't remember what he threw out percentage wise, but it's a lot of them. Moving over to like on the capital side, that's the other thing that I think is really, and again, like your sponsor who you guys partner with is public, but so you don't get anything you can't share. But what we found is that oil and gas private equity and the capital people that on these type, the amount of like, you know, the oil and gas private equity guys and the capital sponsors on that front, they just can't, you know, they'll say things like, well, this just isn't in our mandate for our fund. Like, we're not allowed to deploy on this, or they don't understand Bitcoin, or they can't, you know, it's like this fascination at this point, but it just doesn't seem like these guys are getting pushed pretty heavily to move into like the ESG realm, which I guess if you're doing the flared thing, maybe you can put that angle on it. But we just hadn't had we've got a lot of relationships on that front, talked to a lot of guys, and it's like everybody wants to hear the story and hear but when it comes down to actually like, hey, would you fund something like this? It just doesn't seem like there's any either willingness or ability to do that. Then when you look at like more tech focused or Bitcoin focused type investment groups, there are some just straight lending groups that would lend for miners. But when you really think about like equity and like private equity for that. Like most of the Bitcoin side seems like they want to just give $1 million to a seed round to the guy that's going to build the next like app that does like trading or whatever, you know, or like the next like altcoin or something. Like, you know, they just seem like they're more focused like a tech investor or venture capitalist mindset. We've just found like there's just kind of a void for this business in terms of capital. This is a very highly CapEx intensive business. So tech investors, they're like that's not what their realm of expertise. And then, but the oil and gas investors who are used to putting big dollars to work, they don't understand Bitcoin. So it's like, what were the challenges there? And it seems like you guys were able to solve for that really quickly. And to be honest, I think that's probably the biggest barrier for most groups right now is that you can't get these projects funded.
Yeah, I think you definitely see that, you know, there's people on the tech side that may have access to capital that don't necessarily want to get into the oil and gas space or understand it. And then on the flip side of that, you've got, you know, oil and gas guys that are typically more conservative. It's a more conservative industry, and heavy time spent on analysis and risk mitigation and making sure that 100% of everything is kind of solved, or at least you can understand, like, can you hedge your oil production? You know, everything like that. Like they've got it down to a science, right? And to say it works all the time, I'm not saying that at all. But I think you definitely see, like you say, there's the oil and gas guys don't want to jump into the Bitcoin space, and the Bitcoin, you know, or at least the tech side that has access to capital don't necessarily want to get into the oil and gas space, especially in, you know, the crazy ESG world and potentially trying to stay away from things like that. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I think what you see, especially with some of these private equity groups, is that, you know, everybody's kind of interested in it, and the interest is getting a lot more every single day. There's a lot of people that are doing some great jobs at, you know, educating people, making sure that they understand, teaching them how it works in the oil and gas industry. But, you know, they're going to beat to death their analysis. And the problem is that the industry changes so quickly, the Bitcoin industry. So, and when I'm talking, you know, profitabilities or, you know, initial investments required. So let's say, you know, if you showed somebody a month ago or 2 months ago what the price of an ASIC was, you know, let's say you're going to go buy an S19, and let's say it was before the big crash. So a few months ago, it was like, hey, it might be $10,000 to $12,000 per machine to get in. Here's how many machines you need. Here's how much gas you'd have to dedicate. Well, when the price of Bitcoin drops, like you saw a few months ago, and now, you know, the cost of entry comes down because the ASICs are cheaper. The cost of entry is cheaper, but companies don't want to jump in now because their margins look smaller as well. And they go, we can't afford to do that. Like, look at these big drops. We don't want to get into it. And then on the flip side of that, you can see it too, where it's like, hey, profitability is coming up. Now's a good time to get in. Well, by the time their analysis is done and they've went through their boards and they've went through all of their due diligence, you know, the price of an ASIC may have went up a few $1,000s, and that just completely could potentially change the economics. And then they want to redo it again. And so you almost get into like this vicious cycle when you're talking to some of these groups of reanalyzing because things change so fast that they're just completely unable to ever pull the trigger.
Yeah. It's like your materials for these things are worthless like a day later sometimes, like, right? Or like a week later. Like, put together a big presentation, run all these graphs and models and charts, and you're like, oh, cool, that was yesterday. Today, none of this is relevant, right? And you almost have to just like, we look at things like boil it down to, like, for example, like a hash price or like some kind of more simplified variable, or just have consistent assumptions around difficulty and price, like just different decks, and just run them every time and be like, this is kind of where it's at, this deck today, but here's these other 5 decks that we ran, and you just pick one, right? We don't know like when it's going to be, what that's going to look like. You know, I always used to give people kind of hard time about doing stuff like Monte Carlo. I'm kind of like, yeah, just, you know, that's a little bit overkill, but I mean, maybe for Bitcoin stuff, that's probably not a bad exercise to do. Just run a bunch of different probabilities around some of these things, because it does change so much. And I think that it's going to, more capital is going to come into the space. Like, you're seeing a lot of people that are super interested. It's just going to take time for guys to wrap their head around it. And I think once they do, there will be more capital that comes in. That's so why, just to be candid, where we've looked and started exploring more like on-grid stuff to be able to just kind of simplify the variables for people, even for ourselves, quite frankly. It's like, look, if I want to go do like a, 1 megawatt deal, I can go into the oil field, and maybe that has to be 3 sites for me, right? Because I can't aggregate it. Or maybe it is just 1 site, but there's just all these things to consider, like you mentioned, versus just like, hey, I could lease this piece of farmland right by this substation, and it's a lease that I can terminate. And then, by the way, this power deal is interruptible, and like the friction to get that done is just less. So you just kind of start to gravitate and say, well, maybe that's not a bad option. I mean, the off-grid purists will say, oh, you're subject to the grid and the regulations and all these things, which is true. I mean, there's benefit that we haven't really touched on about being off-grid, just in terms of the philosophical around being regulated and things like that. Although air permits and stuff, there's ways for them to come after you. Don't get me wrong, if they want to. But man, we've jumped through a bunch of different things. I want to be mindful of your time. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties that we've had. I feel like we could do like a series on this stuff, because there's just so many layers you could peel back, and I just love talking about it. I think it's fascinating. I'm looking on the sidelines what you guys are doing. I'm cheering you on, and I'm excited for you guys, because it's just awesome. I think what you're doing, good stuff, man.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, and like I said, I think there's definitely, we've talked about some challenges. I want to make sure I'm not leaving this on a negative note or sound like I'm negative on the industry that I'm in, because I'm not. That's why I'm in it. But, it's definitely good to be mindful. And that's kind of, my career has been built on the risk mitigation side and making sure that I understand all the problems that are in front of me and trying to make sure that I can solve them. But I'm really bullish on the oil and gas industry and Bitcoin mining. I think that there's incredible opportunity. And when I say oil and gas industry, I'm not just talking oil and gas companies. I'm talking, midstream groups, like all the way through the supply chain. There's just so much opportunity for it to allow people to take, some of their product, dedicate some of it to Bitcoin mining, receive, a higher arbitrage, or basically capture that arbitrage difference between what they're able to realize it now. And I think it's just something that the last thing that, I try to talk to operators or different companies about is that, most people never really in their life have had the ability to take natural gas and store it, unless you own a storage cavern, and then sell it at a realized market price in the future that you want. Whereas, that's really what Bitcoin gives you the ability to do, is that you can take your natural gas, let's say it's at a market price that you don't like, or the inability to get into a market, or you just want to, take some percentage of it and try to capture, like we talked about, an arbitrage on it. And you say, okay, well, I'm going to, convert that natural gas to electricity, create Bitcoin out of it. Well, now those MCF, or that gas molecule, you're holding in a digital asset in Bitcoin. And if it continues to do what it's done in the past and in the future, well, you're only going to realize a higher dollar per MCF value on that gas if you can hold on to it. And it's just, that's the part to me that I look at as like the real potential value that people need to be thinking about when they're, in the oil and gas industry and want to get into this space, is like you don't want to just think about it, well, you could get, this much dollars over the market price today, cash out for US dollars and go ahead. It's the people that should be or want to get into this space, the ones that should see the long-term potential for Bitcoin, to take your gas molecule, hold it in Bitcoin, and you could really see that value in the future. If you do at some point want to sell it, be significantly higher than the day that you actually, created that Bitcoin.
Right. The HODL ratio. I did an episode with Dan Frumpkin from Slush Pool Brains, and he was saying that they've got a profitability calculator where they can do they call it the HODL ratio, and you can like adjust it up to where you're just like hodling everything, and then you get the different future potential prices of Bitcoin. And that's when you're like, whoa. Maybe I shouldn't offload this. So no, I think that guys are starting to learn more. I'm trying to educate people on it. I just think that it's just, you don't have to buy into Bitcoin as a technology and as a store of value. But if you do, this all starts to make a lot more sense, right? Like it's one thing that I can get this much per MCF, and that's how I was thinking when I first heard about it. But if you can understand Bitcoin on top of that, that's when people really start to say, okay, the runway here is decades, because this is an emerging financial network that is going to be probably, the number one, or I think it could end up probably being the number one in the world. I mean, if you look at where, in terms of rank as a currency, Bitcoin's already fifth or fourth or something. At one point, third when it got up to $64, or 64,000. So if you look at the future runway here, everybody in our space owes it to become an expert at this, because it's going to change a lot, if not everything, in the way that this industry functions. At some level, I'm not saying you're not going to still produce oil and gas. I'm just saying that it will be a part of people's portfolios, and I think the guys that embrace it are going to be successful the earlier you can start.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's going to be, near 100% of all oil companies at some point in the future are going to have exposure to Bitcoin mining. So or at least exposure to Bitcoin, for sure. So I completely agree. And I think it's the guys that can get in early, I think are going to be the ones that do the best, obviously.
Yeah. I enjoyed this. I really did. Thank you for making the time to come on.
Yeah, you bet, man. I appreciate it. Let's do it again.
Okay, good deal.